Hello and welcome to the News9 Plus Global Summit Show. We are counting down to our biggest and boldest summit yet, where a range of speakers and delegates will gather in New Delhi to exchange views. Now, 2 years ago, on the 24th of February, Russia invaded Ukraine. They triggered off Europe's bloodiest war since the Second World War. Now, this new war threatens the stability of Europe, but it's also impacted food and energy security globally. The war is now in its third year and it shows no signs of ending. Both sides have taken horrific losses. This is the war that changed the world. Neha?
A war that changed the world, Sandeep. There is no doubt that it has proven to be the most devastating and polarizing war in years and decades, some say since World War II. However, what we want to focus on this show, Sandeep, and as we count down to the News9 Global Summit, is the sage advice that came from Prime Minister Narendra Modi,
Yes.
which was conveyed personally and directly by him to the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, on the sidelines of the SCO summit, where he said, this is not an era of war. And those words since then, Sandeep, have echoed around the globe with top world leaders repeating those words, quoting Prime Minister Modi at various multilateral institutions. Those words also finding their way into the Bali G20 summit declaration and the New Delhi declaration that was adopted at the end of the G20 summit last year in India. And that really seems to have become the mantra, so to speak, even though the war is about to enter its third year. And I want to bring in Justin and Aditya into this conversation, both of whom have followed this war very closely. As we speak, Aditya, there is more than one war that's currently on in the world. But talking specifically about the Russia-Ukraine war, in what ways do you believe this war has truly changed the world? And the mantra that was given out by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, telling President Putin, this is not an era of war. Of course, it's not brought the war to an end, but this is advice that has been now repeated by world leaders several times.
Well, what we do realize now, 2 years down the line after the war, is that the world is divided. The world is divided like never before, ever since the Second World War. And a lot of countries, their countries' positions have become clearer. The biggest of all is India, because India has been non-aligned for a very long time, but this time around, last 2 years, India has taken a very consistent independent position. And this means that a lot of countries are upset, a lot of countries are watching India very carefully, and perhaps provoking as well. We've seen that from the very beginning, that Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been engaging with both Vladimir Putin and the leader of Ukraine. We've sent a lot of humanitarian aid to Ukraine, but at the same time, we have had a very robust defense and trade ties with Russia that have only continued, even though there have been provocations coming in, particularly from Europe, and some signaling from Washington DC as well, that we need to change and adopt a new method in this new international world order. But India has stood its ground. India has conveyed to the Western countries that India will look at its interest first. India's interest is paramount, and if Europe can look at its own interest, why won't India? And that's why it is amply clear that India has also become the voice of the global South. And that is also becoming amply clear in these last 2 years. The various summits that have taken place, India's positioning globally on different issues has become much more redefined, much more robust, and the foreign policy of the country is also at a paradigm shift completely if compared to last 10 to 20 years. Yeah. So at the News9 World Summit, we will be discussing this threadbare. In fact, the first 2 sessions of the summit begin with former Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott, in fact speaking about this. He will be also focusing on China, the big elephant in the room. And apart from that, we'll have a very important panel discussion, not an era of war, in which we'll have panelists from Israel, from Austria, from Maldives, and of course from India.
And not to mention that we've got Foreign Minister
The Foreign
Jaishankar
Minister.
speaking, and of course,
I am
the
looking
keynote
forward to
address.
that one. Aditya is going to interview the Foreign Minister, and I'm really looking forward to this because, Sandeep, in just the last few days, the way External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar has put up a stout defense of India-Russia ties in the face of all the Western criticism, from calling out Western hypocrisy, saying that, in terms talking about Russian oil imports, what India buys in a month, Europe buys in an afternoon. From there to saying, Russia's never hurt our interests. It's always been by our side. And therefore, yes, we are proud of the long-standing relationship that we have with that country. Just in the last few days, he has talked about this multiple times, even quipping in the presence of Antony Blinken.
And this was exactly the distance between Jaishankar and Blinken. They were just like sitting next to each other.
At the Munich Security Conference, when, our foreign minister said, well, if I have multiple options, if I'm smart enough to have multiple options, then you should admire me instead of criticizing me. And yes, Antony Blinken was rather dumbfounded there. All he could do was actually giggle, right?
And actually, Justin, you've been tracking, President Putin, Inside the Mind of Putin is Justin's series that he's been, documenting since 2022 when the war began. But what is it about Putin that's so unpredictable? And, he's like this fighter jet that takes off and then goes down and then comes back again. We're at year 3, Justin.
Yes, and see, the war at the soul is like, it's about Ukraine's insecurity and Russia's larger interest at play. So out here, Putin has made it clear that the way that he's going forward, and also right now, he's very much well entrenched where he is right now. So, and Ukraine has completely, in terms of losing out on partners, because US, they support the country within is divided. Republicans are opposed to any more funding happening. So that again proves India stands that, how India stood up against all those pressures continuing. So Putin as a leader has been, like for example, Navalny, the situation with that opposition leader, he didn't bother what the pressure is going to be, because at the end of the day, his economy is right now, the rate growing is more than what the G7 nations are happening right now. And there he's making enough money, so there's no problem for him. His industry is working well. His relationship with major countries like India and China is also very much under control. And he realizes that he doesn't need the support from the West because they are already divided right now. So he has time on his side to continue this war.
Yes, time on his side indeed. But Neha, the story that really stood out for me in the entire Russia-Ukraine war was a story that Aditya put together called The Airlift. That's an award-winning documentary, by the way, which is about how India stepped in and rescued over 22,000 students who were stranded in Ukraine. In fact, let's watch an excerpt from that documentary, Airlift.
Я русский корабль, повторяю, предлагаю сложить оружие, сдаться, иначе по вам будет нанесен удар.
यूक्रेन में एमबीबीएस करने आया था, लेकिन यहाँ का मंजर बिल्कुल बदल गया है। यहाँ कैसा का मंजर है।
हम स्टूडेंट्स सुमी स्टेट यूनिवर्सिटी जो सुमी ओब्लास्ट में रहने वाले स्टूडेंट्स हैं, हम लोग ईस्ट साइड बॉर्डर की तरफ रहते हैं, जहाँ से रशिया सिर्फ 35 से 36 किलोमीटर दूर है।
यहाँ पर कोई भी मदद नहीं मिल रही है।
बाहर हम लोग निकलते हैं तो सारे में माइंस बिछी हुई हैं, तो हम लोग आगे नहीं जा पा रहे हैं उधर।
यहाँ हम फंसे हुए हैं।
प्लीज हमारे लिए मदद करिए या मदद भेजिए।
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Aditya, Airlift. India got Ukraine and Russia to create a temporary ceasefire corridor so that they could evacuate students. Is it part of that not an era of war philosophy that helped us so much?
Well, no country is ready to believe that, but it actually happened. I was tracking this very closely, and this was the time when one of the Indians unfortunately had been killed as well in one of the areas where majority of the medical students were stranded, and we were tracking this very closely. Our reporters were there on ground from TV9. And suddenly we see these phone calls doing rounds between Putin, Zelensky and of course Prime Minister Narendra Modi trying to see that was there a ceasefire a possibility. But he tried to convince both these leaders that ceasefire was a necessity because there were more than 20,000 Indians who were stranded there, most of them medical students. And he made the most impossible possible. And then the Indian diplomats, the Indian medics and Indian volunteers stepped in, brought in buses inside the interiors of Ukraine and actually rescued 22,000 people. And mind you, it was not just Indians. They were Pakistani nationals, they were nationals from Malaysia, from different other countries who were rescued as well. So this is a phenomenal exercise that India has engaged in over the last many years, where not just Ukraine, the recent Israel-Hamas war, a lot of Indians had to come back. We arranged that. Before that, we had the similar situation in Afghanistan. Amidst Taliban takeover, a lot of death, mayhem being noticed, that bomb blast that happened at the Hamid Karzai International Airport, and still Indians were rescued, and that was a dramatic story as well, because Indians were traveling in Kabul towards the airport and the Taliban stopped them. The convoy, the ambassador was there, and then suddenly there were some phone calls doing rounds, and suddenly that convoy moved again, and there were only 12 Indian representatives from the government, from different agencies, who were waiting for them and finally made that last flight out.
And 4 union ministers were sent there.
Absolutely. To Ukraine and all 4 corners from different countries that were managing. And there were a lot of voluntary organizations like ISKCON, Art of Living and others who were chipping in as well. But a phenomenal job. Actually, a Bollywood or a Hollywood film can be made on this kind of a rescue mission, but this has happened continuously in the Middle East, in other places where General V.K. Singh or other leaders have stepped in. But India has ensured that Indians are rescued.
One big great takeaway from India's foreign policy, is it not, Neha? The fact that, no Indian left behind.
Absolutely.
And that's something that you used to see of Western countries, when their nationals are stuck, you have Americans going in, the Marines going there and evacuating them in choppers and all that. Now you have that happening with Indians as well, right? You have Air Force jets landing in the middle of Sudan in the desert.
Just imagine.
Airlifting people out of there.
I think that we've seen multiple examples of that. Perhaps the most iconic in some ways is, of course, what happened during the Kuwait War in the 90s. I think that was the single largest rescue mission, more than 1 lakh, who were brought back home. The movie starring Akshay Kumar called Airlift was also based on that entire episode. And then in recent years, we've seen it happen during the Ukraine War, we've seen it happen during the Sudan conflict, and the most recent example, the 8 Navy veterans who were on death row in Qatar. The court judgment came as an absolute shocker to all Indians. Next thing you know, the government of India intervenes in the matter. The sentences get commuted first, and suddenly overnight comes the great news that the men have been set free and 7 out of 8 of them are already back home.
But the interesting angle here in Ukraine is that Americans and Chinese were stranded. They were stranded for many, many weeks and months. And no American president, no Chinese president actually stepped in to rescue them. And they kept appealing on social media or different platforms, please rescue us. And this was the time when the Indian diplomats actually went inside amidst a war, actually risking their lives, and actually brought in all the Indians.
I agree. And even during the Sudan war, I think what's notable, and Aditya referred to this, is how we rescued people of other nationalities too, not just Indians.
Right. Just, rising tide lifts all boats, as they say. In fact, on that note, let's watch this story by News9 Plus. Justin put that together on year 2, when year 2 of the Russia-Ukraine war was had begun. Justin did that story. Let's take a look at that.
Putin thought Ukraine was weak and the West was divided. He thought he could outlast us. But he's just been plain wrong.
Киевского режима заполучить ядерное оружие. Ведь говорили об этом публично, не для них. За долгие века колониализма, диктата, гегемонии они привыкли, что им все позволено.
Putin is a dictator. He's surrounded by people who share the same views of Ukraine, that Ukraine is not a state. And unfortunately, I think this conflict could go on and on.
His basic demand always has been that no entry of Georgia and Ukraine to NATO, because then Russia is left defenseless.
Have they underestimated Putin? Well, in a sense, they have.
Justin, year 3 has now begun in the war. What's your take? How long is this going to last?
If you've seen the news recently, almost the eastern sector again, the Russians, though it's more of a moral victory, but it's enough to show Ukrainians their own place, their own because they are running out of ammunition again. Yes. They're running out of partners, and this falls well in line with what Putin wants, because at the end of the day, he's not there to conquer the entire Ukraine. He doesn't want that.
He just wants the Russian.
He just wants the Russian parts out there, and he's already has majority of them, and he's well entrenched. The warfare that is following right now, it's all, you know, you're battling for every block by block, land by land. That will continue, and for Russians, that is their best play, because they do not bother about how many died or how many casualties happen, because because all the wars they have fought till now, there have been millions of Russians dying. So that's part of their lifestyle. They believe, I mean, the citizens of the country know that, you know, if you're sacrificing for the country, that's part of you being a Russian out there. So for Russia, for Putin, it's a war that is going to, I mean, anything that is going to gain is Russia and Putin.
Right. In fact, interesting that we have this BG of a artillery gun going off here in Ukraine, and the fact is that remarkable turnaround in Russia's military equipment, they're calling it the Kalashnikov economy, and how Russia has actually gone back to the Second World War. They're producing artillery shells at a humongous rate, something like 3 to 4 million shells.
Just one point added to that. The part that they are praising about is that with drones and artillery, they are able to, you know, the strikes they're claiming that almost 200% better strikes they're able to make when they have combined, you know, drones with artillery. And that's game changing for them.
And clearly this generous help coming in from Russia's allies, North Korea, China and Iran. Just this week there were reports about how Iran has produced huge amount of missiles to Russia for its ongoing war. But Aditya, if I could just ask you this question. 2 years down the road, does it not look like Zelensky is fighting a rather lonely war here? Yes, you could argue that, you know, the NATO is behind him, President Biden, America keeps, you know, announcing new aid packages for Kiev. But fact of the matter is that, you know, the appetite in the US for continued aid and support to Kiev is decreasing. If you have a situation where Trump's come back to power in the US, that could drastically impact the way Ukraine is fighting this war in Russia. And you know, the fact that membership of NATO is not happening anytime in the foreseeable future. Russia still seems to be in a very strong position, and there's general fatigue with war. Where does that leave Ukraine and Zelensky?
Well, I'll be a devil's advocate, and I'll say that from the day one, Zelensky was always alone. You know, it was always a lonely battle for Ukraine, because, you know, they desperately were seeking a European citizen, you know, membership. And apart from that, you know, the Americans, the Europeans were doing this for propaganda. They were sending in some military aid, you know, one by one, of course. But then Zelensky alone was fighting that war. There were no massive boots on ground. There was a lot of ammunition that was sent in. But this is going to be a long war. Russia has been prepared and perhaps has surprised a lot of people with this ongoing, continuing war, which we haven't seen an end of. But I think Putin also realizes now, over the last few months, that Americans are engaged. The Americans are engaged in a second war, and this second war is between Israel and Hamas that has continued ever since the 7th October terror attack that happened, and more than 1,500 people were killed in that. And now we've had, unfortunately, 29,000 casualties in Gaza. As per the health ministry in Gaza, we don't have a definite number to it, but that war is also continuing, and Israel doesn't want to look the other way. There's a lot of global pressure on Israel, but as we have known on Israel as well, that they are certainly not going to look the other way. They are going to get inside Gaza as they have, and they are going to reoccupy that entire territory, and there will be again a new Gaza, a new reality that has been already created, and what we will see over the next 6 months will be a new Gaza that will be created. Who will govern that will be a critical question. But as I said, the proxies of Iran attacking Americans in that entire region again is a game changer, not just for the Israel-Hamas war, but for the Russia-Ukraine war as well.
That is quite true. And China, in fact, just the other day, Sandeep, was very critical of the US vetoing the Algerian resolution at the UN Security Council, which had sought an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Right. So we've seen, of course, the US unflinchingly standing behind Israel, especially at UN on multiple occasions. But there are many who believe that even Americans are losing patience with the Biden administration over his unconditional support to Netanyahu's war, given the high casualties that we've seen in Gaza. And therefore, I don't know if it's time for Prime Minister Modi to perhaps pick up the phone and speak to his friend Bibi and tell him to, this is not an era of war.
This is not an era of, exactly. And given the fact that they're looking at something like 3 parallel conflicts on, currently in the world, the Houthi conflict, and then you go north up the Red Sea, you have Israel and Hamas, and then finally you have this Russia-Ukraine war. 3 very different conflicts.
And the mastermind, Iran, behind all of this.
But yeah, Iran is the common factor in all these 3 conflicts.
Unfortunately, it's been a setback for India as well because of the economic corridor that was being spoken about. It was a big victory after the G20 summit, apart from the consensus that was achieved. And India, America, and a lot of countries were going all across and saying that this economic corridor is going to be a game changer. It is also being seen as a competition to the BRI in itself. A lot of articles were written about it. It was being analyzed threadbare because BRI isn't really a hot-selling, sexy corridor as much as it was 10 years ago. So one is that. Secondly, I think, speaking about India, has had a very interesting position when Israel and Palestine are concerned. I've been there multiple times, and I am really flabbergasted the way, people love India, not just in Israel, but in Palestine as well. If I speak to a car mechanic and I met the president, the feeling is same for India. They remember Indira Gandhi and they remember Modi. There's no in between or before or after. So these 2 leaders are a hit globally. And in Palestine, in Israel, there's an understanding that India will stand with you. There is a lot of humanitarian aid that has gone to Palestine already in the last 5 months, but India condemns terrorism. India stands with Israel and has a strategic partnership, defense ties, a lot of it public, but most of it not public, classified.
Foreign Minister Jaishankar actually, very gently told the Israelis that, the thing about collateral, civilian casualties was a very, very big concern.
And not to mention that India has also repeatedly said we are committed to the 2-state solution and to Palestinian statehood, despite Netanyahu saying 100 times that we reject the Palestinian statehood.
Right. But I mean, frankly, there cannot be another solution to the Palestinian issue, because if you're even looking at something like, as Aditya mentioned, the IMEC, the India Middle East Economic Corridor, one of the fundamental things for that has to be Saudi Arabia shaking hands with Israel. And that the Saudis
that nearly
have
happened,
it
but
nearly
it's
happened.
on ice
so close
now,
to that.
thanks to this war.
And when the attack happened on the 7th of October, we were all in a discussion, Aditya, Kartikeya and me, and the first thing I said, oh my God, this comes just when IMEC is almost inked. And it came right in the middle of that. And Neha, there cannot be a solution to the IMEC if the 2-state solution is not implemented by Israel. And that is a precondition that the Arabs have made for, normalizing ties with Israel, that you need to have that 2-state solution. And sooner or later, Netanyahu will have to come around to the policy that...
Can I just mention this here? Because I've done a series of shows on the Israel-Hamas war. It is abundantly clear to everyone, Sandeep, that except for Israel, the entire world believes that the 2-state solution is the only solution, so much so that that Israel's staunchest ally, the United States, is on record as having said, and I'm not just talking about White House spokespersons, I'm not just talking about Antony Blinken, no less than President Biden himself has conveyed this personally to Netanyahu and said so publicly, that Palestinian statehood is the only solution and way forward, and that is in fact emerged as a huge area of divergence in this war between the 2 allies.
So, in a manner of speaking, the war that changed the world, it's not just the Russia-Ukraine war, it's equally the Israel-Hamas war as well, because I mean these are, and what we forget is when we made these sweeping statements, if you remember, Neha, Aditya, Justin, many years back, people said that, wars of the future are going to be very short, sharp and swift and decisive, little realizing the fact that wars are done for a political purpose. And as long as that political purpose is not achieved, the fighting will go on. And that clearly seems to be the lesson from these 3 wars that we're seeing running on parallel. But Justin, quick take on the war now in Russia and Ukraine. Year 3, will there be a year 4, or do you see Vladimir Putin agreeing to a peace deal now, as you said, that he's happy with what he has, the Russian-speaking territories of Ukraine, and let's talk peace.
And if I could just add to that, what is his end game? Of course, he wants to make sure that NATO is not in his backyard. I think that's what started the war. But what is his end game?
So I think the interesting part would be here to listen to what Trump had recently said. And he has said recently, I mean, he's been on record saying that anybody who's not paying for NATO is, can be, targeted by Putin. So I think it's very clear to him that as long as they don't interfere on his backyard or the sphere of influence that the Russia or the imperial Russia had, he's okay with everyone ready to go, because he was earlier. So out here right now, the time is on his side. So he has the territory that he required. So it is now the move that Zelensky has to make, which will decide how this war will end. Because for him, he is comfortable right now.
He's comfortable right now. It's very telling words there. He's comfortable because, as we were discussing earlier, that President Putin has grabbed territory the size of Tamil Nadu from Ukraine. I mean, that's how massive that territory is. And Ukraine, in all its counteroffensives, has only managed to take back territory the size of Sikkim. So that's the kind of imbalance that you're looking at. And now that territory that Russia controls is being protected by the Russian Federation and all its nuclear weapons, which is why you now see President Putin flying around in nuclear-capable bombers, that he's, signaling to the rest of the world, listen, this is stage 3, or, this is what's coming next if you don't talk peace now. Get Zelensky to sit down with me.
Yes. So Zelensky has to make the next move. Americans are divided, and it could be further divided if the Republicans come in. Europeans are anyways worried about what America is going to do if Trump comes in. So everyone is divided except probably India, who had already foreseen what the situation would like to be, and they had already aligned in India's interest as per what requirement was. Like for example, the oil, you are refining the oil and giving to the Europeans, who are happily taking it. And also for the fact that West Asian countries had hiked up oil prices and selling it to Europeans, and Indians had nowhere to go again. So our interest came into play there, which was very much aligned to what the situation is right now. So India is comfortable, India is in a safe place, and I guess that's the example that the world needs to follow.
Can I just add one point
Absolutely.
there? It's very interesting. I have noticed, Sandeep, how the entire world is very keenly watching the US presidential election, because the outcome is going to impact each of these issues and wars that we've just discussed. Talking about Russia, Ukraine, if Trump is back in power, I think it's a lot of trouble for Zelensky. Interestingly, the far-right minister in Netanyahu's cabinet, Ben Gvir, is on record as saying we would have been better off if Trump was the president right now, despite all the support that they've got from the Biden administration, clearly not leaving Biden amused. So much so that when I was doing a show on the recent Pakistan elections the other day, a Pakistani guest told me that if Trump comes back to power in the US, Imran Khan, the former prime minister who's behind bars, his troubles will be over.
Oh, right.
Yes, so it's going to be a very interesting and important election in the US.
Absolutely, and in fact, some time back I remember reading this thing, Neha, about how this writer made this pitch that the rest of the world ought to have a say in who the president of the United States is.
Because it impacts everyone.
Yeah, it impacts everyone. It impacts every
We should get a vote, perhaps.
We should, countries should be able to vote, who they want.
Especially Indians.
Yeah, especially Indians, given the large diaspora that we have over there. But, the other interesting underlying theme of all these wars that we are talking about, these 3 parallel wars that we've been talking about, is the intelligence failure. 4 wars and 3 intelligence failures just tells you that from 9/11, it's just downhill. Every war being preceded by the main thing is that your inability to read your opponent's mind, the fact that his fighting will and underestimating his capacity to fight you. I think that's the underlying theme of this. But there will be many more such discussions at the global summit. Of course, Aditya has the lion's share. He's going to talk to Foreign Minister Jaishankar, and he's got the session on war. Now is not the era for war, but I'd like to thank all of you for this discussion this evening on the run-up, the countdown that we have to the News9 Global Summit. Thanks very much, Neha, Aditya and Justin. Keep watching us for the News9 Global Summit. Season 2 of Dialogue with Barun Das has just been uploaded on the News9 Plus app. We leave you with this glimpse of this cerebral conversation. Watch Barun Das and Jeev Milkha Singh discuss life, golf, and parenting in a heart-to-heart conversation. Download and watch the entire series. Thank you for watching.
By chance, I went to the golf course with my father. He started playing. I started playing. I had good company. Started got involved.
He was an amateur golfer.
He just played for fun.
He was a legend. You need to match up to him. But you had that pressure too. But you turned it on its head.
My dad was this person who was very firm. Dinner, everybody 8 o'clock in the evening on the dinner table. I gave him the prize money. I said, thank you, Dad, for what you've done for me in my life. He said, son, would you like a drink? So, ek piya, do piye. When I made third drink dala, so he used to look at my mother and says, Mama, he sportsman hai. Third drink pi raha hai. Kehte sportsman do se zyada nahi peete.
Oh, what was your experience when you were teeing off with Tiger Woods?
Tiger was the hottest player, and I said, Tiger, don't be nervous today because there are going to be a lot of Indians following me. So we tee off. On the first hole, as we're walking up, and he says, Jeev, I see a lot of white Indians following us today.